In 2024, the European Union raised new tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, a 17% duty on BYD models, and yeah, even higher for others. It was meant to slow a flood of imports and protect local car makers from cheap, state-backed rivals. On paper, the wall looked strong. But on the streets of Europe, a different story was already unfolding. In cities from Berlin to Paris, sleek BYD taxis and rental cars began to appear. Silent, bright, efficient. While Brussels debated protectionism, Europe's largest car rental firm, Sixt, quietly signed one of the biggest fleet deals in history, 100,000 BYD vehicles over the coming years. Two images, one contradiction. In the halls of Parliament, barriers were built. On the highways, those same barriers seemed invisible. It's the paradox at the center of this story. How can Europe raise tariffs and still flood its streets with Chinese cars? Because this isn't just about trade. It's about what people drive, what they pay, and who shapes the future of Europe's mobility. This story matters because it's not just about politics. It's about people's wallets and daily lives. Every tariff sounds abstract until it hits the street. A 17% duty might not sound like much on paper, but it stacks. First the base import tax, then the anti-subsidy duty, then dealer margins. By the time it reaches the showroom, that small policy can mean thousands of euros added to the price of an electric car. For the average European driver, that's the difference between switching to an EV this year or waiting another 2. For taxi drivers, it decides whether they can afford to replace their old diesel fleet. And for city governments, it shapes how fast they can transition to clean transport. Imagine a fleet manager in Berlin or Madrid. They're juggling costs, energy, maintenance, taxes, and now tariffs. A price jump of even 10% across hundreds of vehicles can wreck a business plan. That's why deals like Sixt matter. They ripple outward, influencing rental prices, ride-hailing fares, and even public EV adoption rates. And beyond the numbers, there's national pride at stake. European automakers built the continent's identity for a century. Now they're being outpaced by new players, faster, cheaper, and in many cases, cleaner. So when we talk about tariffs and trade walls, we're really talking about who wins the next decade of mobility and who pays for it. To understand how Europe reached this point, we need to rewind. In 2023, the European Commission launched a formal anti-subsidy and anti-dumping investigation into Chinese electric vehicles. The goal was simple: find out whether China's EV makers, companies like BYD, Sixt, and Geely, were selling cars in Europe at artificially low prices thanks to heavy state support back home. In plain terms, dumping means selling something abroad for less than it costs to make, usually because your government is footing part of the bill. The EU worried that this would crush European car makers who couldn't compete with such low prices. Brussels moved fast. By mid-2024, investigators had examined financial records, subsidies, and shipping data. Their conclusion? Chinese EVs were benefiting from unfair state aid, loans, tax breaks, and low-cost components backed by Beijing's industrial policy. So, in October 2024, the EU imposed new duties. BYD faced an extra 17% tariff, Geely around 19.9%, and Sixt a steep 35.3%. All on top of the existing 10% import duty every foreign car pays at the border. For Brussels, this was meant to level the playing field, a message that Europe would defend its own industry. Yet, even as these tariffs hit, something unexpected happened. Fleet buyers and rental companies didn't back away. That raises a question Brussels didn't fully answer. If the EU acted so decisively, why didn't it stop major deals like Sixt's from moving forward? Let's break down what those tariffs actually mean in real-world terms. Take a BYD electric sedan with a base export price of $20,000. Before tariffs, shipping and local distribution might push its European retail price to around $25,000. But add a 10% import duty, then an extra 17% tariff, and suddenly the final cost jumps to roughly $32,750. That's almost $8,000 more for the same car. Now compare that with a European-made EV of similar size and performance that costs around $35,000 to $38,000. Even after all those tariffs, the Chinese model can still undercut local brands. That's the crucial part. Most people miss tariffs bite, but they don't necessarily kill competitiveness. Think of tariffs like adding weights to a runner's ankles. They slow you down, but if you're already faster, you can still win the race. For companies like BYD, lower manufacturing costs, vertical integration, and massive domestic scale mean they can absorb part of the tariff and still make a profit. Meanwhile, European automakers, burdened with higher labor costs and slower production cycles, can't easily drop prices to match. This is why, even with Europe's new trade barriers, the math for buyers, especially large fleet buyers, still works out in BYD's favor. And that brings us to what happened next, the immediate ripple across the auto industry. When Brussels announced the tariffs, the first reaction across the auto industry was shock, followed quickly by hesitation. Companies that had been preparing to expand production in Europe suddenly hit pause. A few Chinese automakers began re-evaluating plans for local assembly plants in countries like Germany, Hungary, and Spain. Internal calculations changed overnight. What once looked like a profitable gateway into Europe now carried new layers of cost and uncertainty. Some firms quietly shifted their attention to Southeast Asia. Headlines in late 2024 showed new investment maps lighting up across Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam, places offering friendlier tax deals and fewer political risks. One BYD executive even called the region the new bridge between China and global EV demand. European construction sites told a different story. Cranes went still. Factory projects that had been in early groundwork stages were shelved or delayed. Even suppliers, battery pack makers, component companies, began freezing hiring plans. From the outside, it looked like the EU's plan was working. Pressure was pushing production away. But beneath that surface was a strange twist. Because even as factories were reconsidered, orders were not stopping. Fleet companies, rental operators, and logistics firms kept signing contracts with BYD and other Chinese brands. And the biggest shock was still to come, when one of Europe's most recognized names, Sixt, made a move that completely flipped the script. In late 2024, as most automakers were still recalculating their European strategies, Sixt dropped a bombshell, a deal to purchase 100,000 BYD electric vehicles. The announcement sent ripples through both political and business circles. On one side, Brussels was tightening trade barriers to slow down Chinese EVs. On the other, one of Europe's largest mobility companies was doing the exact opposite, committing to fill its fleets with them. To grasp the scale, Sixt isn't a small rental chain. It operates in over 100 countries, with hubs across Europe, North America, the Middle East, Australia, and New Zealand. Its bright orange logo sits on thousands of airport lots, train stations, and city centers. When Sixt shifts its fleet strategy, entire markets notice. The deal with BYD wasn't a minor test run. It was a multi-year partnership, starting with deliveries of the BYD Auto 3, Dolphin, and Seal models across major European cities, then expanding to other regions. The vehicles would serve as rentals, ride-share fleets, and corporate leases. In simple terms, Sixt didn't just buy cars. It bet on a new supply chain. While politicians built walls, Sixt built bridges. That's why this moment became the curveball no one expected. Tariffs were supposed to scare off demand. Instead, they collided with market logic and lost. Now the real question was why? Why would a major European fleet operator double down on Chinese EVs just as tariffs made them costlier? To answer that, we have to understand how fleet economics rewrite the rules of the market. For individual buyers, a few thousand euros can make or break a decision. But for fleet operators like Sixt, economics work on an entirely different scale. Fleet managers don't look at the sticker price, they focus on total cost of ownership, or TCO. How much the vehicle costs to buy, operate, maintain, and eventually sell. Over 5 or 6 years, that number matters far more than the upfront price. Here's the math. Let's say a traditional European EV costs €35,000, while a BYD costs €30,000 even after tariffs. The BYD might save around €5,000 per unit, not much on its own. But multiply that by 10,000 vehicles, and the savings climb to €50 million. Across Sixt's full 100,000 car plan, that's potentially €500 million in long-term cost advantage. Then add cheaper maintenance. BYD builds its own batteries, motors, and chips, meaning fewer outsourced parts and less downtime. Fewer breakdowns, faster repairs, and predictable servicing schedules all save fleets enormous money. Fleet operators also get bulk electricity pricing for charging, often locking in multi-year contracts. A few cents per kilowatt-hour difference translates into thousands of euros per vehicle across its lifespan. Put simply, Sixt's move wasn't about ideology, it was about math. Even with tariffs, BYD's vertically integrated model made its vehicles the most cost-effective fleet option. That's why, in the language of business, tariffs were just a variable. What mattered more was efficiency, reliability, and uptime, the lifeblood of a fleet business. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. Beyond just cost, BYD's reliability and local partnerships made the deal even harder to ignore. Fleet operators can accept higher prices, but not uncertainty. That's where BYD's real advantage begins. Unlike many fast-growing automakers, BYD didn't just ship cars to Europe and hope for the best. It built an ecosystem around them. Its vehicles use a modular battery design, the Blade battery, known for safety, long lifespan, and easy serviceability. That matters for fleets running cars day and night, where downtime kills profits. BYD also started setting up regional service centers and parts hubs in key European cities, Amsterdam, Munich, and Paris among them, ensuring that maintenance or battery swaps happen in hours, not weeks. Partnering with local service providers gave European fleets what they needed most: confidence that these cars wouldn't sit idle waiting for parts. Then there's charging. BYD's partnerships with charging networks like Shell Recharge and Octopus EV created bundled fleet packages, predictable charging costs, and streamlined fleet management software. For big operators like Sixt, that's gold. This is where BYD separated itself from other low-cost competitors. It wasn't just selling cars, it was selling uptime, guaranteed reliability supported by growing local infrastructure. A fleet manager doesn't care about badge prestige, they care about vehicles staying on the road. And in that equation, BYD delivered something Europe's legacy automakers had struggled to match: a dependable, cost-predictable fleet platform at scale. But Sixt's partnership wasn't only about solving today's problems. It was also, a calculated step toward the future of fleets, one where cars drive themselves. Behind the massive car order lies a longer game: data, autonomy, and control of future mobility systems. For fleet operators like Sixt, the electric transition isn't just about replacing engines with batteries. It's about preparing for a world where vehicles will eventually drive themselves, communicate with each other, and be managed by centralized software platforms. That shift will cut one of the biggest costs in mobility: drivers, and turn cars into rolling data centers. BYD understands this perfectly. Beyond building cars, it builds vehicle control systems, sensors, and software backbones that feed performance and usage data into the cloud. This is the infrastructure needed for autonomous and semi-autonomous fleets. Partnering early gives companies like Sixt a head start in shaping those systems, or at least securing access to them before they're locked behind competitors' ecosystems. In a sense, the 100,000 car deal isn't just a fleet purchase. It's a platform buy-in. Each vehicle becomes a data node, gathering insights on charging patterns, urban traffic, battery health, and driver behavior. Those metrics, scaled across Europe, will determine who leads the next generation of mobility, the ones who build the cars or the ones who control the data. This is why BYD's growing foothold worries rivals far beyond car sales. It's not just about who sells the EV, it's about who owns the network that powers autonomous fleets. And that leads straight into the next stage of this story, the backlash. Because when markets shift this dramatically, competitors and politicians start to react. The backlash came fast and loud. Within weeks of Sixt deal-making headlines, the industry split into two camps. On one side were executives and politicians warning that Europe was handing its future to China. On the other were market realists arguing that consumers and fleets were simply choosing what worked best. Tesla was among the first to weigh in. Elon Musk, during a press Q&A in early 2025, warned that Chinese automakers could demolish most competitors if trade barriers fall. He wasn't exaggerating. Tesla had already seen BYD surpass it in global EV sales and knew that once those same affordable, well-built models saturated Europe's fleets, brand loyalty might no longer protect them. European automakers echoed similar concerns. Volkswagen executives publicly called for fair competition, a polite way of demanding tighter restrictions. Meanwhile, consumer reactions told a different story. Surveys showed younger buyers under 35 were far more open to Chinese EVs, caring less about origin and more about design, tech features, and price. Online debates exploded. Some argued that buying Chinese meant betraying European jobs. Others said tariffs only punished consumers and slowed climate goals. The tension revealed a generational and ideological divide: protectionism versus practicality. For BYD, though, the noise was proof of relevance. It had moved from being an outsider to a threat big enough to provoke Tesla, Brussels, and Berlin. But even as the criticism mounted, BYD and other Chinese automakers were already preparing their counterplay. A move that could neutralize tariffs, silence critics, and win local favor all at once. Localization. Localization became the quiet, strategic escape hatch. If tariffs made imported cars expensive, then the solution was simple: build them locally. By assembling vehicles inside Europe, BYD and other Chinese automakers could bypass most of the import duties, create jobs, and reshape the political conversation from foreign competition to foreign investment. Several European governments saw the opportunity. Hungary, already home to KTL's massive battery plant, courted BYD with tax incentives and land offers. France hinted at welcoming partial assembly for electric buses. Even Germany, despite its fierce political rhetoric, quietly signaled interest in partnerships that could protect its suppliers and preserve industrial know-how. Localization doesn't just mean factories, it means setting up parts networks, regional supply chains, and technician training centers, infrastructure that roots a company in the local economy. Once thousands of local jobs are created, politicians find it harder to attack the same company they just cut ribbons for. BYD's playbook was clear. Ship cars now through fleet deals. Build local capacity once market share grows. Rebrand as a European producer, not an importer. It's the same strategy Japan and Korea used decades ago. Toyota, Hyundai, and others followed that path from outsiders to local manufacturers. BYD is simply repeating history, accelerated by electric tech. And once that localization takes hold, tariffs lose their teeth. What began as a trade wall could end as an open door. So where does all this lead? Let's map out the three most likely futures that could shape Europe's EV market next. The road ahead could split in three very different directions, each shaping Europe's mobility future in its own way. Scenario A, the fleet rollout. In this path, BYD's momentum continues. Sixt's 100,000 car plan unfolds smoothly, inspiring copycat deals from other rental and ride-hailing giants. European streets fill quietly with Chinese EVs wrapped in local logos. Consumers get cheaper rides and faster EV access, but local automakers struggle to keep up. Signals to watch: new large-scale fleet contracts, rising BYD market share in cities, and growing presence of BYD-branded service centers across Europe. Scenario B: the political pushback. Here, pressure mounts from both European manufacturers and policymakers. Brussels raises non-tariff barriers, tougher safety standards, data security rules, or local content quotas, making it harder for Chinese EVs to operate freely. Governments promote Buy European campaigns, and public subsidies tilt heavily toward homegrown brands. Signals to watch: new EU regulatory proposals, trade disputes in the WTO, or tightened local procurement rules for electric fleets. Scenario C: localization and autonomy. In this outcome, BYD fully embraces Europe. Factories open in Hungary or Spain, local workers assemble vehicles, and political resistance softens. Partnerships form between BYD and European tech firms on autonomous driving and data infrastructure, creating a hybrid ecosystem, part Chinese efficiency, part European governance. Signals to watch: factory groundbreakings, local hiring drives, data sharing agreements, and joint autonomy projects. Each future tells a story about power and adaptation. Whether walls hold or roads stay open will depend on how fast Europe balances protection with progress. And as the world watches, one truth remains: mobility doesn't wait for politics. It moves with whoever builds the better machine. Next, let's bring it all home with a clear conclusion: what this paradox teaches us and where the real winners might emerge. At the end of this story, one truth stands out. Politics can slow markets, but rarely can it stop them. The EU tried to build a wall: tariffs, investigations, and protectionist rules to keep Chinese EVs from flooding the continent. Yet, the moment those walls went up, the market found a door. Sixt's 100,000 car deal with BYD proved that when economics make sense, business moves forward anyway. Fleet operators don't see flags, they see numbers. A car that costs less, runs longer, and needs fewer repairs is more than a vehicle. It's a financial strategy. And that logic, multiplied across thousands of cars, becomes unstoppable. This deal isn't just about one company or one region. It's a turning point in global mobility, where the balance between politics and profit, sovereignty and scale, is being tested in real time. Europe's protectionism might shape policy headlines, but the quiet fleets rolling out across cities could shape the streets themselves. So the real question now isn't, will Chinese EVs survive in Europe? It's, how quickly will they adapt? And who else will follow? Would you rent or ride in a BYD taxi in your city? Politics can build walls, but economics often finds the open road. That's the lesson behind the BYD Sixt paradox. On one side, Europe tried to slow the wave of Chinese electric vehicles with some of the toughest tariffs in its trade history. On the other, the continent's largest rental and mobility company signed a massive 100,000 car deal with a Chinese brand anyway. The message couldn't be clearer. When the math makes sense, business moves forward, tariffs or not. This moment isn't just about cars. It's about the tug-of-war between policy and progress, between governments trying to protect homegrown industries and global markets that reward efficiency, affordability, and innovation. BYD didn't break Europe's rules, it worked around them. Through smart partnerships, localization plans, and future-oriented bets like autonomous driving, it turned resistance into opportunity. The bigger question now isn't whether Chinese EVs will enter Europe. They already have. It's whether Europe will adapt fast enough to compete on cost, scale, and technology. Because when the next generation of drivers steps into a BYD taxi or rental, they may not care where it's built, only that it's electric, reliable, and affordable. So let's end with a question for you. Would you ride or rent a BYD in your city? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll feature the best takes in the next video. And if you want to keep following how tariffs, tech, and fleet strategies are reshaping global mobility, make sure to subscribe, ring the bell, and stay tuned. Because this story isn't ending anytime soon. It's only just beginning.